I am Doug Wingate. We are going to talk about the eight-dimensional self. It's an introduction to the eight-circuit model of consciousness. This is something that I've been working with personally for about the last almost 25 years or so, and then use clinically and have used that for the last 15 years or so. So, like I said, I want to lay some foundation down on kind of what is this, what we're going to be talking about, and then we'll talk about some of the applications a little bit and how it can be utilized in our daily life for self-development, and also if you're working with other people, either just interrelationally, so in our relationships with others, or if you're using it in a clinical setting, how it can be applied there. So the eight circuit model of consciousness has been around since about the 1970s. It was originally proposed and talked about by Timothy Leary as a way to discuss kind of the range of human experience. So taking into account a lot of our current understanding and also giving consideration to some of those parts of human experience that we are able to have, but may not be consistent or not everybody necessarily has, but show up frequently enough and have been discussed for centuries and not really having a workable model to apply that information, much less navigate it. So the eight circuit model of consciousness, or it's also been referred to as the eight dimensions of mind, or here the eight dimensions of self. I prefer that because it's a little bit more all-encompassing than just the mind. It includes mind, body, dynamics. I've also referred to it as the octave of intelligence, and part of the reason for that is a way to look at the eight circuit model that I found really handy is to think of it in terms of different types of intelligence that we have access to. So I think it's pretty common to have some awareness around how developed somebody is in terms of emotional intelligence, or if somebody is very cerebral and rational, they have that linear compartmentalized intelligence. And then there's been some conversation around like social intelligence and how easily people navigate that interrelational dynamic. And with this model, it gives a perspective where we can increase our awareness and increase or with that awareness be able to increase our intelligence in each of these capacities. So it is made up of eight different intelligences or eight different previously referred to as circuits. I'm okay with that term because when it was originally developed, it was referring to like the brain as a computer type dynamic, and now we have a different understanding of circuitry uh, in terms of neurology, and there are all of these different circuits of brain areas that are interacting and have different influences or handle different states and different experiences. So, while I still use that term more and more, I've been using different types of intelligence that we experience. And so we'll go into each one of these in just a little bit, but briefly, they're made up of two sort of categories. The first being the personal circuits or the personal egoic types of intelligence. And then there's a whole other subsection that doesn't really tend to get discussed too much outside of like psychospiritual realms or depth psychology and things like that, or transpersonal psychology. And this is the transpersonal realm. Transpersonal refers to just meaning beyond the personal ego. So these tend to be associated with more expanded states, non-ordinary states of consciousness that are experienced during spiritual development, or they can happen spontaneously. You can have mystical experiences, and these are all kind of encompassed into what's referred to as the transpersonal realm. So on the personal side, we have somatic or body intelligence. We have emotional intelligence, symbolic, which is the rational linear intelligence. We have social intelligence, and then on that, as we talk about the transpersonal elements or the range of human experience, we have sensory intelligence. It's referred to as meta intelligence. So meta being self-referential, meaning that we'll get into it, but it means that we become aware of our own capacity and the way that we take a look at things and are able to evaluate and make changes to that. There's collective intelligence and then there's unitive intelligence. And we'll get into each one of these. As we're navigating these and talking about them, there's also a term that's often used in the Eighth Circuit literature referring to chapel perilous. This is a poetic way of talking about spiritual emergencies that can happen. So as people are navigating or having certain experience, sometimes they can be shocking or jarring, and they can kind of shake the foundations of the way that we see the world. And with that can come some sort of tumultuous experience in trying to figure out what to do with that, or it can be destabilizing for some people. And so when we are working with this, being aware of that and having some tools to help navigate or integrate those experiences can be extremely helpful. So, if I refer to chapel perilous or spiritual emergencies, we won't get too much into that today, but just know that it is a component and it's often talked about in that literature. So in essence, as I kind of said, I found the Eight Circuit models super helpful in terms of having an increased awareness or increased perspective on how myself or others are navigating in the world and how they're seeing reality. So they can be sort of different lenses, similar to how there are different learning styles. So some people are more kinesthetic in their learning style. They're more active. Other people are much more cerebral and take in information just by reading. Other people need to be more emotionally engaged, or they learn better with interaction. So there are different sort of learning styles, and there are also different sort of attachment styles that people have. Very similarly, there are certain affinities for types of intelligence or circuits that people tend to operate from. And which one of those somebody tends to favor can be the result of a number of different things. So it can be the result of their upbringing. It can be the result of experiences during certain times of their life that have lent themselves to either just having more experiences in a particular realm, or sometimes it's as a coping mechanism. So examples, well, with the first four circuits in particular, they're very uh, they tend to be linear and developmental, and so this is kind of the realm of most of psychology that's out there. Most standard models of psychology navigate and talk about these realms. And as we'll see, the transpersonal realms don't tend to get talked about nearly as much. There are like subsections and schools of thought that do discuss it. But for the most part, mainstream psychology and psychological approaches tend to address just these. And they do tend to happen linearly. So as the human being, as we're developing as a child, we tend to go through different stages where we're particularly receptive to what's called imprinting. So we can have a very strong type of experience, and based on our experience during that developmental period, we tend to take on a particular perspective in relation to each one of these types of intelligence. So they do start at somatic intelligence. So when we're a really little child, when we're an infant, information comes into us through our body. We don't really have the mental models to put words to anything. We don't have the language to put to our experiences. It's somaticized. It's experienced through the body. And if you watch an infant, like that's how they navigate the world. They put everything in their mouth. They want to touch it. They want to see how it feels. And in terms of their experience, it's very like, what does this feel like? There's no words to put to it. And then emotional intelligence tends to develop more around the age of like 2 or 3, where the personal ego, the child realizes that they're separate from their mom and a separate autonomous being. And with that comes a lot of emotions. So of course, if you think about like a 2, 3-year old, there's a lot of emotions that are happening in that during that time. It can be really tumultuous, but it also is the time when we start developing an awareness of our personal self and emotions and what we're feeling emotion wise. And then around the age of like 6, 7, 8 years old, we develop more of a symbolic intelligence where prior to that, whether or not we're experiencing something um, externally or internally, there's no real differentiation. So if to a toddler, the if you're watching a horror movie, that experience is experienced really no different than if they have a real live threat that they've gone through or that they're experiencing. So there's this difficulty in differentiation. And around this 6, 7, 8 period age period, we're able to sort of step back from that and see that there's a sort of a well, there's a separation between that. So symbols and models of reality, and we can think about things, and it doesn't necessarily make them all true. And it also opens up more linear logic like mathematics and things like that. So we're able to use more of what's considered our executive function or our higher cognitive capacities to like develop these ways of making sense in the world. This is where we learn to more read and write and sort of pull in the direct experience and extract that into something external. So we're able to make that differentiation. And then around the time of puberty, um, there's a significant development or shift towards social intelligence and the importance of interrelational dynamics with other people. And so, of course, we have like social experiences prior to that, but the brain really shifts, and all of these are backed up by neuroscience. So we go through different phases where the brain is very plastic. It's creating new neural connections around these particular types of intelligence. And so how neuroscience plays into this. But it is backed by that. And each one of these are just kind of different phases that our nervous system or our brain goes through in terms of developing these particular types of intelligence. We can have those types of experiences prior to this time period where our nervous system is really ingraining or taking this imprint, but there's a significant emphasis during these particular developmental times. And so if we don't have the type of experiences that lend themselves to proper development for these types of intelligence, it can be more difficult to revisit them and develop these in the future, but it's definitely possible. And so if we can increase our awareness of where we might be lacking or where we might have taken a particularly what's referred to as a heavy imprint. So if we have a really strong experience in a particular type of intelligence, we'll tend to lean on that or favor that, which can be helpful in some ways and can also be hindering in some ways because it can deter or sometimes even shut down other types of intelligence. So that's the way that a lot of this is taken a look at in terms of like what do you do with the information? Like, if you're aware that like if you had a great example is early life trauma. So if you had early life trauma, like during early developmental phases in the first couple years of your life, that's going to be taken on and it's going to be experienced at a very deep somatic level in our body, and that can throw off our relationship to our body for tentatively the rest of our life. So if scarcity was an issue, then people may try to hold on to things a lot more. And the somatic intelligence is all about survival and safety and security. So it's feeling safe in ourself and feeling safe in our body and tending to our survival needs and nourishing what our body needs in order to survive. And if those things are not provided, then we can take on what's considered a negative first circuit imprint, where we may uh, even subconsciously or sometimes consciously neglect those parts of ourself. And so we may not tend to our body the way that would really be helpful, or we may not even tune into that at all. So there can be this detachment from the body. So things like dissociation can happen, where we just lose what's referred to as interoception, an awareness of what's going on inside of our body. Those feedback mechanisms of what's happening inside of us just kind of get shut down. And as you can see on the slide, this has been discussed in like classical psychology. Freud referred to it as the oral stage. Piaget referred to it as like the sensory motor stage. So this is an area again where everything is perceived and taken in through the body. It's not necessarily rationally thought through. With the emotional intelligence, they said this tends to develop around the age of 2 or 3 or so, where we start to develop an awareness of autonomy and an awareness of personal self, and personal ego starts to develop. And with that, we experience a lot of emotional needs. And developmentally, if during this phase where we're taking a really big influence of how we take a look at the world through emotional intelligence, if that's shut down, so if we're told to not feel emotions or to hide our emotions, or it's not appropriate to feel those things or express those things, this can also continue to play out into our adult life. By the same token, if we learned that by throwing tantrums or making a lot of noise and being very assertive gets us what we want, that may also become a pattern that plays out and can develop into an unhealthy realm as well if it becomes too much. So with each one of these, it's by increasing the awareness, we're looking to find a healthy integrated balance in each one, and there's extreme ends of the spectrum when it comes to each one of these types of intelligence. So the more that we can become aware of it, the more that we can navigate these things. By the same token, if we know somebody else is like highly impacted or highly imprinted or operating from a particular circuit or a particular type of intelligence, so if somebody is just overly emotional all of the time. I think we all know adults that all seem like they're still acting like toddlers at times. They're just very emotional or very reactive. Um, and to have some recognition around that, then we can navigate that on our end and either meet them where they are or work with them with some understanding of where they're coming from. And by the same token, if somebody has a very strong circuit 3 imprint, they're going to be very rational and maybe fairly removed from their emotions. If somebody has a really strong symbolic intelligence imprint or circuit 3 imprint, sometimes it's a compensation and they'll shut down their emotions that they feel and instead overcompensate with very rational perspectives on things. And so, not only emotional intelligence, but they may override the somatic intelligence as well. So, if an example of this is if there wasn't a lot of reinforcement in early development, where there wasn't a strong reinforcement of the body, there wasn't a strong reinforcement of the emotions, as these higher cognitive capacities come online, people may overcompensate with that logic and not really focus in on what their body is doing, or emotions might seem silly or shut down or not worth approaching. And so that's one of the like far end examples of somebody who has a very prevalent symbolic intelligence or circuit 3 approach to things or view of reality, the way that they perceive and the way that they navigate through reality. So like I talked about, symbolic intelligence is that like linear logic, um, symbolic thought has to do with articulation, language, semantics, writing, mathematics, innovation, and creativity. This is like the sciences, the hard sciences. Um, and what are referred to as executive functions. So Piaget in standard psychology is referred to this as the concrete operational stage, and then social intelligence, as I mentioned, starts to really take an uptick around adolescence and puberty. So there's this big shift for a lot of uh, kids going through this stage where, of course, we there's social interactions and friend groups and things like that, but there's this transitional phase away from the family unit to where friends and social circles or external groups become much more important and much more yeah, a bigger part of all of our lives during this phase. And then um, things time and the transition into the adult role. So from childhood going through adolescence and then moving into like what's considered to be an adult in society. So sort of that transitional phase. And so that includes cultural expectations and norms and morals and what's to be expected in order to fit within and successfully navigate culture. So there's going to be individual cultural variances depending on what culture you're in, but overall there's this development of like how do we navigate and successfully socially engage within society. And so we have that development of social intelligence, and that's referred to as the formal operational stage by Piaget. So again, all of this is like encompassed within standard, but it can be very helpful to have an awareness of where we kind of land on this in areas where we may not be particularly strong. And then a lot of the application of the eight circuit model is how can we navigate or how can we get better and increase different types of intelligence depending on where we tend to land and where we may benefit from having developed more or increased that. So beyond that, um, we have sort of the second set of circuits, circuits 5 through 8, that include sensory intelligence, meta intelligence, collective intelligence, and unitive intelligence. These are a little bit different from the first four. The first four, like I said, standard psychology, tend to be linear, they're developmental, they're pretty much every human in modern society has some degree of development within each one of those. Like I said, certain life experiences can hinder some of those intelligences, and then other experiences may really bring an emphasis to different ones. But it becomes very different when we start talking about the transpersonal dimensions of self. This is taking a look at human experiences that happen consistently enough that it's been well established, and there's research taking a look at these, and many people have reported them for centuries, but they're not consistently built within our culture, and our culture does not really, it tends to give these short shrift. They don't really talk about them too much, despite the consistency. And so this is one of the components of the eight circuit model, or the eight dimensions of self, that tend to go unrecognized. These are aspects of the human experience or aspects of self that tend to not get nearly as much attention. And part of that is because not necessarily everybody has these type of experiences. There are certain life experiences or practices that lend themselves to accessing these types of intelligence and honing these or increasing these, but not everybody experiences them. They often entail some sort of practice. Like I said before, or at least alluded to before, they can happen spontaneously. And the more consistently that we undergo that particular practice or we have these experiences, the more we're able to develop this in these different types of intelligences and apply them, navigate them, and utilize them for our own benefit. So a lot of these have to do with not only what's considered transpersonal experiences, which means beyond the personal ego. So there's an expansion of a sense of self, or an expansion in sense of connectivity in most of these. Sensory intelligence, we tend to also with each one of these, we tend to develop more of a conscious awareness or a conscious control over aspects of our how we perceive reality or how we navigate our human experience. And so with sensory intelligence, there tends to be an expansion beyond the self to an awareness of greater connection with those around you in the group or as human beings as a whole, or they're more of a connection with nature and an understanding that there's this larger global connection. So, like if you're familiar with the hypothesis. This is an awareness that the Earth is a one large organism that has a lot of moving parts and us being just a component of that part, and that there's a interconnection between that, an interrelationship that's going on. Meta intelligence is and it well, let me go back. With the sensory intelligence, it's also allows for a conscious control of our body and what we feel and our sensations and how comfortable we feel um, within that. So it's an ability to have more awareness and generate better sensory experiences, better body experiences. So it's associated with like senses of awe when you're in nature and you're just overwhelmed by beauty. It's associated with pleasurable experiences and actually allowing yourself to experience pleasure or heightened pleasure and sit within those. So it's been referred to as like rapturous experiences. An example, it's also has to do with like getting quote unquote high in the sense of like not only with external substances, but like there's a runner's high the people experience where when you're running after a certain period of time, you have a lot of endorphins going in your system and you get this like runner's high. And part of one of the pitfalls with sensory intelligence is that you can become kind of addicted to that high, whether or not it's running, whether or not it's an external substance. Whether or not it's meditation and getting really caught up in the blissful experience that you can experience with meditation. That can become a distraction from navigating the rest of the world, and that's one of the pitfalls that can happen with sensory intelligence. But it's the capacity and the ability to heighten that sensory experience and sit within uh, that sort of bliss that can be experienced. Meta intelligence is an expansion where you become much more consciously aware of and thus able to have conscious aware of our own internal processes, like the way that we think about things, different belief systems or different um, mental structures that we've established in terms of the way that we look at the world and having a broader view of how we take a look at the world and how others take a look at the world and being able to really, if it makes sense to, reevaluate some of those perspectives, reevaluate those models that we've made of reality or the way that we take a look at the world and consciously shift those. So this is where a lot of healing from negative patterns that have been set up early in life comes into play. If we can increase the awareness um, and and integrate that in and bring in practices that reinforce that, then we're able to address some of the negative imprints that may have impacted us early in life and change the way that we take a look at things. But we need to increase our awareness and be aware of those processes in order to even do that. Collective intelligence moves beyond the personal self to where there's a recognition of threads that transcend personal self into the collective nature or the collective threads within humanity. So this is like Jungian art. Well, I'll just go ahead and switch over to the next slide. This is like Jungian archetypal work. These are concepts that tend to um, exist within the whole of human experiences and tend to be themes that come up over and over again for different people throughout time. So this also includes generational traumas or memories. We now understand that traumas and memories from our ancestors, from our parents and grandparents and great grandparents, these things get passed on at the genetic level. And so this includes, we now have an understanding of epigenetics and how we interact with the world has a direct impact on our genome and how our genetics express, and that this gets passed on. And this is considered having awareness of that and working with that and taking that into conscious consideration and conscious work is the role of collective intelligence. It's also associated with concepts like synchronicity, so these meaningful coincidences that tend to show up within life. And in some sense, this is also people who have tend to have mystical experiences where they have interactions with external beings, whatever that might be. It can be a projection of self. It may be um, like different in fairy tales, there's different entities that show up. This can be experiences where people have direct interaction with angels or demons or there's a whole range of entity experiences that have been reported over and over again. Um, and this falls within the collective intelligence. These are archetypal figures or archetypal structures that tend to show up. And there are also archetypal components of self or components of human life, personal life that tend to show up as well. And so these are these common collective threads that spread throughout uh, the human experience within our genetics and much more broad than just the personal egoic experience. And then circuit eight, unitive experiences are types of experiences that have been described as non-dual or where people experience like ego, what's referred to as ego death or ego dissolution, where the personal ego just seems to dissolve or be split away or shed. And people experience this great expanded connection or unity with not only other humans, not only the earth, but like this unity with everything around us. And while this is kind of rarefied air, like I said, not everybody has these type of experiences. It's been recorded for centuries and consistently, and now we have ways to to sort of induce these experiences. There are brain stimulating devices now that have been able to bring on out of body and near-death experiences. Near-death experiences definitely falls within this, where it's an experience outside of one's body or outside of one's perceived physical sense of self, and anything that's expanded beyond that, where we become more aware of that interconnectivity or that uh, temporariness of self and being able to expand beyond that and get a wider perspective than that all falls within what's considered unitive experience or unitive intelligence in those types of experiences. And these transpersonal circuits, unlike the first four, are nonlinear. So somebody may not have a Circuit 5 experience, but might suddenly be thrown into a spontaneous Circuit 7 experience where um, generational trauma comes up or they have these interaction with entities or somebody has a spontaneous out of body experience or near death experience then then you can certainly have those experiences without having necessarily developed Circuit 5. And so there's a non-linearity here where it doesn't necessarily progress from one or another. And a lot of the emphasis in working with the eight circuit model is that it's non-hierarchical. So, uh, like one is not considered better than another. These are just different dimensions, different components of ourself that we have within our capacity, within the human experience to develop or work with or have an awareness around. And the more that we can have this awareness and successfully navigate, there are certain situations where one circuit, well, operating from one circuit or being, for instance, more rational or linear makes more sense for a particular situation. So we may lean into our symbolic intelligence of circuit 3 in that particular moment. And then later in the day, we may tend to our circuit 5 sensory experience and allow ourselves to just rest and soak in the pleasurable experience of being ourselves and appreciating um, uh, our experiences, everything that we're taking in from art to enjoying sensations on the body. Um, and then later we may need to tend to some of our biosurvival needs of circuit one and the somatic intelligence, where we nourish the body, tend to it, and make sure that it's cared for, and that we have this established sense of safety that we can return to. So, a big emphasis on working with the model is that it's non-hierarchical, that each of these are accessible. Some of them take some work to get there, um, especially with and around transpersonal circuits. Like I said, there are practices that exist to be able to access that or grow that type of intelligence, but culturally, it doesn't tend to get talked about a lot. So some people just never really have those experiences or develop them. So why why discuss this? The model was originally t developed by Dr. Timothy Leary, who, of course, has quite a reputation for being a counterculture um, legend. But prior to that, he was a Harvard professor in psychology and developed a lot of well-established, still applied theories around personality and around relational dynamics. And some of his personality tests are still used around the world today. And so this was one of his theories as he was working with people and looking at the wide range of experiences. Uh, Transpersonal states of consciousness, and then there was more awareness and more interest in like non-psychedelic ways to access these. So taking a look at Eastern practices of meditation and taking a look at occult practices that are geared toward expanded states of consciousness, and tantra that uses sexual interaction to like raise consciousness or expand consciousness or increase the sensory experience to allow for these altered or non-ordinary states. Um, but in as our accessibility to information is increasing, and as just kind of culture moves along, we are allowed increased accessibility to these more transpersonal realms, and there's been more and more interest in transpersonal and non-ordinary states of consciousness. There's more research around it. Like I said, there's neuroscience taking a look at like what is really going on and what's happening. But as I said, it can be consistently um, brought about enough to be able to do that research, and also just as science gets better and we have more understanding as a whole. Like when this not model was originally developed, there was no understanding of what epigenetics were. So there was a conversation around genetic components and how we can influence our genes and how our genes influence our experience and how individuals who reach these altered states of consciousness um, have these experiences. Like there was no underlying science to really back it up too much. So this is where this has continued to be reinforced. We now having that understanding, we can then um, better access that or more consciously be aware of how we're impacting that and grow that intelligence within ourselves. Um, the eight circuit model is considered what's called a meta model or referred to as a meta model. And what that means is that it in itself um, can be a very helpful tool in taking a look at things and having a perspective without rigidly adhering to just this model. So, as I said, like Freudian psychology, Piaget's psychology, developmental psychology fits within this, and as does transpersonal psychology, as does Eastern mystical traditions, as does Western occult traditions. There's different ways of that have been used and different models that are out there. And we'll see when it comes to psychology and therapy and things like that, there's a bunch of different approaches. And all of this can be encompassed, or at least the e-cigarette model can be a helpful perspective, a hopeful lens in seeing um, a different way of taking a look at that and making sense with it and practically working with it, which is the big component here, is that a lot of the discussion around psychology, transpersonal psychology, altered states of consciousness, expanded states of consciousness, there's not a whole lot of practicality. There are practices, but the interrelationship um, is tends not to be discussed too much, and it tends to be more theoretical. And so a lot of the work that I do with the eight circuit model, it's much more practical application. And so it can be just a helpful lens in making sense of how other things kind of fit within this. It can be a great platform for integration of destabilizing situations. So, like I said, if somebody has a sudden mystical experience, it can be really jarring. It can be really destabilizing. People can feel like they've lost their mind because it's so foreign, it's so different, that they don't know what to do with it. And that can be a struggle sometimes for years, or it never really gets integrated because there's no way to make any sort of meaning of that experience, even though it's a shared experience that thousands of individuals have had. If you have no context, if you have no model to make sense of that or tools to navigate that, then it can be really destabilizing and cause a lot of issues, or sometimes to the point where we can't really integrate into society because it's been so destabilizing. It can be the model can be a great form of self-work. So increasing that awareness of where we're coming from, if we happen to lean into or favor a certain type of intelligence, where we might increase different types of intelligence to be able to help us um, just navigate the world better and have a better understanding of self and self-development, so that we have a more whole um, whole experience as a human. I'll briefly make mention that there's what's called a vertical relationship or a vertical dynamic between the circuits. So there's the higher circuits or the transpersonal circuits tend to be sort of higher order recapitulations of the lower circuits. So circuit one has to do with safety and our relationship with our body, and circuit five has to do with conscious, not only control, but conscious awareness of our body and what we can do with it as a sensory apparatus and making the most of that. And there's a relationship between the circuit two, egoic, um, emotional responses and emotional intelligence, and circuit six, meta intelligence, the ability to sort of reevaluate how we take a look at things and how we reinterpret things. So circuit two tends to be very black and white thinking, very rigid thought patterns and belief systems. Circuit six reevaluates or allows for a more broad perspective on taking a look at those and looking at things from different perspectives, multiple perspectives simultaneously. And there's a relationship between circuit three symbology, which is a very linear logic, and then there's a different level of symbology that happens in terms of the archetypal figures and archetypal symbology with circuit seven, and then there's a relationship between circuit four and eight as well. So when we're working with these, we can be aware of that and say if we get way super spaced out with a blissful circuit five experience, easy to get distracted with that, and we're just kind of floating around in the blissful ether. It can be very grounding to take part in something that helps reinforce or nourish circuit one to help ground us and kind of bring us back solidly into our body. So that's taken into consideration when we're working with this. The higher circuits or the transpersonal circuits can act as a shock to break free from some rigid patterns that we might have established. So an example of this is if we have a really negative circuit one imprint where we've lost a lot of our relationship with our body, or we don't feel safe within ourself, or we feel like the world itself is not safe. Um, Circuit 5 experiences blissful states, states of rapturous awe, of being able to feel comfortable in heightening the sensory experience that's pleasurable can help break out of rigid patterns that we may get stuck in terms of that lack of safety or lack of relationship with the body. So there can be sort of a healing that can happen there. Um, so that's how utilizing the transpersonal circuits or intelligences can be helpful in reassessing or addressing or um, benefiting some of the negative patterns that we can get caught up in. By the same token, like I said, with the Circuit 5 experiences or with transpersonal circuits, if somebody gets too far out there and is having a difficult time integrating things in, you can use that lower circuit relationship to bring that in and integrate it in order to make more sense of it or be able to bring it more into everyday application. And then I mentioned so the risk of some spiritual emergencies that can happen or what's traditionally been called like the dark night of the soul experiences that people tend to go through as people have transpersonal experiences. They can be very jarring, and with that, one can feel like they've gotten really lost and not know what to do with that. There are a number of different spiritual emergencies that can come up with that, and so within this work, there are like exercises that you can do to be helpful in integrating some of that in. There are different ways to work with the different types of intelligence. So there are different exercises and prompts for reflection. I re authored a book that was released earlier this year, basically taking the model and updating it with modern neuroscience and modern psychological models, um, and um, have a workbook that's Wilson, Ansaro Ali, that have some really great exercises that you can actively do. So if you know that you want to work on your somatic intelligence, you know that you want to work on your relationship with your body and safety, then there are exercises that can be helpful in reinforcing that. And by the same token, if you need to feel it would be helpful to increase social intelligence, then there are exercises and prompts that can be helpful in increasing that or working with that or exposing ourselves to situations that increase that intelligence. By the same token, there's activating activities. For instance, with circuit one and the relationship with the body, like getting in and taking a bath can be extremely grounding in our body and increases our interoception. There are different, so we have a greater awareness of what's going on inside of our body. That information becomes more to the forefront, and it allows us to become more aware of our body intelligence, our somatic intelligence. Um, by the same token, me doing this right now is a circuit three activity, very linear information coming your way. So there, depending on what circuit, what type of intelligence you want to increase or work on, there's different activities that have an affinity in growing that type of intelligence. There are uh, external resources that tend to have an affinity or tend to activate or tend to work on different levels of intelligence. So there are certain natural substances like herbs. There's conversations around different essential oils that have been utilized for different circuits, and there are external triggers that. And what I mean by that are external substances that we can consume that tends to bring on a particular type of intelligence. So, like alcohol is a very much a circuit to emotional trigger. It tends to make people more emotional, tends to be um, disinhibit people, and can really bring on some of that like toddler-like, very emotional behavior. Whereas caffeine is an external trigger for circuit 3 material. So it kicks your brain into um, firing faster. The neurons are firing faster, and so uh, somebody's mind is making connections a lot faster, and those mental capacities just kind of kick into overdrive. Whereas like opioids tend to have an influence on circuit one. They tend to shut emotions down. They tend to shut the executive function down to where we're kind of just moved into much more of a receptive state to what's coming in, and that's much more akin to the Circuit One experience of when we're a child, a little baby, and everything's just kind of coming in. We're not necessarily interacting with the world too much, so much as information is just coming in, and we're receptive or we're passively receiving that information. By the same token, like psychedelics are external triggers for some of the transpersonal states, and that's the topic of next week. So if that's something that you're interested in, I'll have a talk on that too. There are archetypal systems that you can use to work with the material and different types of intelligence too. So the archetypal systems are like a circuit seven way of working with this type of material, but they can be applied to and interpreted in relationship to all of the different circuits or all of the different types of intelligence. I've released a couple books on material on the I Ching and the ruins and how these systems, the Tarot has been referenced, the Jewish Kabbalah system has similarities to relationships that we're discussing here in terms of different types of intelligence or different levels of yeah, these human experiences. And then I have also worked with and written a book comparing Eastern philosophy and Eastern medicine approaches and how they intertwine or have a relationship with the model as well. So there are different ways and different interpretations, different models that fit within the metal model. They can be informative and helpful tools depending on where somebody is coming at. So if somebody has a highly developed Circuit 7 intelligence, and they're really just working on that archetypal level most of the time, it can be difficult to interpret or bring that into most of culture and society. So that can be quite difficult. These are some of the very spiritual people that are just kind of seem dialed into these larger um, interconnected global levels of thinking. And so using the archetypal systems can be a helpful tool for somebody who has that tendency in sort of making sense or a different lens to bring in and work with this material. And then there's different targeted psychotherapeutic approaches. So I work with a lot of clinicians and discuss this material with a lot of therapists and clinicians. And even if you're just doing self work and you have an awareness that like, man, my circuit one, my somatic intelligence is just not where it needs to be. Like there are different approaches within therapy that can be applied. They're going to be particularly reinforcing or particularly helpful in working with a certain circuit or with a particular type of intelligence. So therapies that tend to work with the body, somatic therapies, body work, psychomotor psychotherapy, trauma release exercises, EMDR all fall into approaches that tend to have an affinity or work on the level of more of somatic experiences. Whereas cognitive behavioral therapy, talk therapy, is going to have more of an affinity or be better received by individuals who tend to work more from a circuit three symbolic, very linear executive function type perspective or lens on reality. So this is, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but this is just another way that you can take a look at it. Like if I'm doing the work and what approaches might be helpful in addressing a particular one or working on or increasing our intelligence around a particular one. Um, then this is another way that you can approach that. That's most of what I have. If you're interested in more about the eight circuit model as a whole, there's a bunch of books out there. Like I said, it was originally put forth by Timothy Leary. His perspective on it had a lot more to do with our species as a whole, not only having these experiences, but also the evolution and future development of the human species. So his idea was the transpersonal experiences historically have been not nearly as prevalent. So you have these mystics, you have spiritual leaders, you have individuals that have spontaneous mystical experiences, you have shamans, you have individuals who have taken psychedelics and had these expanded states. But that as we progress um, forward as a culture, as a species, that we will have more access to these, and that it's those recorded more isolated instances are kind of a lens at where the potential for humanity to go. So that's more of his perspective is taking that more evolutionary bent on things in terms of how he discusses it. Robert Anton Wilson has a book called Prometheus Rising. It's great if you're looking for exercises. At the end of each chapter, he has exercises to kind of give you a better idea and really embody each one of these. And Taro Lee has a couple books that focus on personal ritual and meaning making of each of the circuits to also embody those, but different practices that you can bring in into your life in order to work with each circuit. And then there's some contemporary resources there, but I'm not going to go through each one. I will make mention of my book that came out this last year with Dr. Turetsky, Circuit Ascension, which is where a lot of the material we basically tried to update, like I said, everything with modern neuroscience and modern psychological models, and heavy discussion around some of the exogenous triggers, including the psychedelics, which again I'll talk about next week. Uh, I want to open it up if anybody wants to have this or has any questions, or anything at all.
I have a question, Doug.
Yeah,
So when you're working with people on a practical level on with this sort of model, does it tend to be more about trying to pinpoint like areas of deficiency, like circuits where they may be deficient or have an issue and kind of focusing in on that to bring it back into balance? Or does it sometimes does it tend to be more of like bringing the overall like all eight circuits into some sort of balance together? Like maybe if someone doesn't have a particular deficiency, is there like an overall goal or target that you tend to try and move someone towards, like an even balance between all eight circuits, or is there like a bell curve among them
yeah,
that is ideal or optimal? Or um, I guess like say someone doesn't really have much experience with say seven and eight at all.
right.
Maybe they never have experiences with those circuits. Would that be considered like a deficiency in general, where you'd want to try and bring them into a balance among all, or would that be considered maybe just perfectly fine if that works for them?
Yeah, so there's a degree of it being perfectly fine if it works for them in terms of like more of a pathologizing way of looking at things. When I'm working with somebody practically with this, if there happens to be what would be considered a deficiency in a particular circuit or an excess in a particular circuit. So if somebody leans really heavily into like circuit two power dynamics, really egotistic type behaviors where they don't have control over their emotions. That's more of an excess type situation. If there are those sorts of imbalances, that's going to be usually the the first place that we're going to take a look at and want to do some work is if there's a clear imbalance in a particular circuit either way, they haven't developed, or the opposite end of that, if they've shut down their emotions and they don't have access to that at all, then you have sort of a circuit two deficiency. We want to bring that into balance so that there's uh, access to that and it's navigated in a healthy way. And then in a broader perspective of work, so that would be like first priority if I'm working with somebody. If there's a clear imbalance that somebody would really benefit from, then we want to help support that particular circuit. So then we would do at least start with circuit two work, but have larger conversations around the circuits as a whole, and then the sort of overarching goal when it comes to working within the model or just self-development and the human experience is uh, increasing and developing a healthy relationship with each one. So if somebody hasn't had a circuit ex 8 experience, um, it's not like pathological, and people go through their whole lives without having circuit 7, circuit 8 experiences. It happens all the time. Um, but if somebody it is a portion of the human experience that is accessible to us. And if we develop and we have those type of experiences, they can be very helpful in broadening perspective and allowing for healing and shifting in the other circuits. And ultimately, what we're working for is an increased awareness, increased intelligence, within each, even if we're not accessing it at all times, having an awareness of it. So, um, like circuit eight can be anything f from the ego death type experiences to just an increased awareness around our own mortality, and which in our culture tends to really get pushed down and doesn't tend to get discussed much at all until it happens. And so there's this great fear around sort of self-annihilation, and what happens when we are no longer in our present human experience as we experience it. And so by having those circuit eight experiences, like I do with the psychedelic work, people have these ego deaths, and like they feel like they've died. They go through the experience of dying. They don't physically die, of course, but they have to let go. There's this component of letting go and expanding to the point that they are able to, and then experience this annihilation, and then have this broadened experience. And it can be really eye-opening in terms of how you look at all of the other portions of your life, all of the other components, all of the other levels of intelligence. And so, um, there are all kinds of religions and mystical schools that actively promote, you're working toward enlightenment, and then the idea of like the bodhisattva, you have this enlightened experience, and then what do you do with it? Well, you come back and you carry water and chop wood. You go back to the world, but you do so with a wider perspective and a greater appreciation for the interconnected nature of everything. And so, if we're able to develop a harmonious relationship and an understanding of the interrelationship or the dynamics within ourselves of these different types of intelligence, then it lends itself to a more harmonious, hopefully happy human experience.
Great answer. Thanks, Doug.